Thank you so much, Naukan. I hope you all can hear me well. So hi, everyone. A very good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Pavitra, and I work as a coordinator at the Asia for Animals Coalition, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session on reinforcing the narrative of equality and equity and moving towards a connected justice for animals, people, and the planet. We are thrilled to have three wonderful speakers with us today who will walk us through how we can effectively engage with policymakers and how to make our issues relevant by shifting perceptions and narratives and apply it to drive long-term change. Our first speaker today is Andrea Echeverri, who resides in Colombia. So unfortunately, she cannot be here with us today, but she has been kind enough to pre-record and share her presentation with us. Andrea is an environmentalist and feminist who has dedicated the last 12 years of her life to environmental justice, from the impulse to just relations between people and nature and between human groups. She's been a part of many grassroots movements and civil society organizations, mainly in Colombia and Latin America. She's currently the coordinator of the Global Forest Coalition's Unsustainable Livestock Campaign. Just a quick reminder to all of you that we'll have the Q&A session towards the end of all the presentations. So if you have any questions right now, please feel free to post them in the comment box. We have our team collating the questions for later. Can we please have Andrea's presentation?
Yes, thank you, Pavitra. And I will share the presentation now.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Echeverri. I regret not having the possibility to be there with you during this webinar, but it's around 1 a.m. for me, the time that it's going to be live, so it's kind of difficult. Anyway, I'm really glad to be here somehow, and I appreciate the invitation of Asia for Animals for this opportunity, but also especially for arranging this series of webinar, because we need discussions on these topics, these overall topics, to actually tackle the crisis or the multiple crises that we're living in. My name is Andrea Echeverri. I'm part of the GFC staff as Unsustainable Livestock Campaign Coordinator, but I'm also part of the steering committee of the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign. And today I'm here to share some thoughts, which I call reflections and possibilities for overcoming interrelated crises. So I didn't put them as crises because we have so many that it will be difficult to define the water crisis, the food crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, the social crisis, the economical crisis. I just wanted to highlight some concerns on which we have some data to show how what has been done is not working, because despite a huge number of resources and efforts put into these three topics, figures don't lie, and situation has only worsened in recent years. So the first one is the one that relates to biodiversity loss. The second one is the climate change, or climate crisis. The third one are the social injustices, which it's also a broad topic, but I'll try to focus in bullet points. So regarding biodiversity loss, what is here, it's at least sad. I don't even know how to describe it because it's outrageous. Wildlife population have declined 69% since 1970, and humans, who are just less like 1% of life regarding species or biomass, have destroyed 83% of wild mammals. In the right side of the screen, you can see a graphic that I took from The Guardian, on which they explain how much humankind affected other species. And right now, basically all mammals in the world are whether livestock or humans. 30% of mammals are humans and 60% is livestock. Only 4% right now or mammals are wild mammals, wild animals. And to birds it's a similar situation because only 30% are wild birds. 70% of birds are chicken or poultry. That means, and when you go through the CBD reports or the FAO reports or others that talk about the biodiversity loss, they usually talk about humankind, but without acknowledging that it's not humankind. It's a way of consumption. It's also a differentiation between the responsibilities of different countries on different companies. So this can be just said that human life has destroyed biodiversity, because we know that communities, that indigenous communities, that local communities, that women can and do relate to biodiversity and even increase rates of biodiversity. So that's one of the things that we need to discuss and to put in the radar to understand one of the many reasons why what has been done for biodiversity just hasn't been working. And also that relates to climate change. Well, I recently came from the intersessional meetings of the UN subsidiary bodies, and it's alarming, it's disturbing what you get to see there, because it feels like the problem is not taken as seriously as it should, as science is telling us. Because remember, last year was published the report, the IPCC report that is called AR6, or it's known as AR6. And what it says, it's something that we already knew, but we didn't know that it was so bad, because the impacts of climate change are wider, are broader, and are faster and more intense than we thought. That's why Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, described it as an atlas, sorry, don't know how to pronounce it, of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And that's not minor if we understand the role that he has in the UN, but it means that the pathway we have been going through this last 31 years since the UNFCCC was created in '92 hasn't been the right way, because year by year you see how emissions are rising, how climate change impacts are getting worse, and for that you don't even need to see the papers. I mean, there's so much said on climate change that the anecdotic has become scientific and the other way around. But the most disturbing part is that the narrative that we can see during those negotiations is that the UN, the delegations are not trying to reduce emissions. They're trying to maintain us with these false solutions or with this dangerous distraction, such as technophysics, such as the so-called nature-based solutions, which include, but those are not all of them, geoengineering and carbon offsets. And that's something that, regarding narrative, we have to understand that doesn't mean they're actually reducing the emissions. It's a matter of avoidance. So the devil is in the details, and we have to be really careful what's going on and what's been said and what our proposals from organization are, because even if we have nice intentions, it might be easy to not understanding a lot of things that are going on. So it's a good thing that these webinars are happening, because we all probably will be learning a lot between all of us, and with the knowledge that all of us have. You can see some figures that I took also from the well, those were made by the World Resource Institute, but also based on the report that I mentioned earlier. One last thing that I wanted to say on the matter on climate change is that it's a topic that is not really that has not been a priority during the negotiations. And you can't forget that even if we left all fossil fuels on the ground, only the food system as it goes today will rise temperature globally over 1.5 degrees. And finally, on social injustices, there's a lot that we could say. Especially I'm a sociologist and I have been studying for a lot of years the nexus, the links between the environmental injustices and the social injustices, which are always worse for women and girls, for indigenous people, for local communities, for small-scale fisher, for small-scale holders. So it's a problem that is not being all addressed together. The social crisis, the economic concentration, the health crises, and all, because it's the same problem as we're going to discuss above. And one of those problems expresses a lot in agriculture. South Asia and Latin America exhibit the highest inequality on land tenure and agriculture, with top 10% landowners capturing up to 75% of the agricultural land. So that's another injustice that emerges from the food system worldwide, which is not even feeding the world, because of the FAO stated last year, as many as 828 million people, it's suffering from hunger. That means the figures are even higher than in preceding years. So we have a food system that's poisoning our rivers, that's making our women sick, that is causing displacements of indigenous people, of traditional communities, and that's not even succeeded on feeding the world. So the UNFCCC acknowledged that there is an interplanetary a planetary crisis, which refers to three interlinked issues. Specifically, they mention climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, but they do not talk about ways to tackle them together, because they say each of these issues has its own causes and effects, and each one has to be resolved separately. So I think that's one of the things that we need to take into account to move forward and to make life possible for humankind and for all living beings in this planet. Because actually what's happening, and it's different expression of the same crisis, of the same system, which is shaped by capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. But I'm not referring to patriarchy only as the dominance on men over women and over other genders, but it's also a matter of especism, of androcentrism, which is thinking that the world is for men, not for humankind. And we know that it's mostly for one kind of men, from white men from the north who have shaped this world and who suffer differently from the impacts of what they have done. So addressing the symptoms and not the causes will not solve the different problems in the long term. We need to have an holistic side, an holistic and integrated side that is also responsive to the different territories and contexts. Something that acknowledges the common but differentiated responsibilities in this world crisis, this multiple crises that we're experiencing right now. And there are a lot of possibilities. Of course, there are the possibilities of grassroots defenders of people on the ground, etc., that are what basically, at least for me, what gives me hope, what makes me think that there's a future for this planet where we can all live together in a just and more equitable way. But there are also some other ways of action that include demanding in a strong way to some of the organizations that are involved somehow in the crisis to make the right decisions, to be wise. And for one of the decisions is the thing of the divestment and the investing. So there is an urgent need to divest from the current false solutions, which include monoculture, tree plantation, bioenergy, geoengineering, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, red flash, which we have a lot in Colombia, and it has definitely not worked for its initial purpose. Also, we need to divest from the expansion of industrial livestock. You probably know better than me the impact that it has on deforestation, on zoonotic diseases, on climate, the impact that it has on wildlife, on women. And that's something that I'm not going to further discuss here, because I think we have some resources that we could share, and I will be grateful if you share some information that you think that might be interesting for us. But also we need to redirect, for instance, the climate finance, these fiscal policies to support real solutions in the climate crisis, in particular, gender just and right-based solutions. Also, we need to invest in with active community participation and consent to support small and mid-scale agroecological production systems, also including gender equality. The transformation or overcoming the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis can happen without overcoming the social injustices, without overcoming the gender gap or the discrimination and the difficulties that are facing indigenous people worldwide, that is Global South facing. So we need to find ways to talk to more effectively to some actors that are involved in these investments, to see how we can make some radical changes. And I specifically wanted to concentrate on the divestment thing because the recent launch of two briefings. One that is called Divest Public Climate Finance from False Solution, a roadmap towards gender just and real climate justice, by the Global Forest Coalition. And also there's one of the S3F campaign that was written by Friends of the Earth International, but involved all of the steering committee, where it's also Bank Information Center, Synergia Animal, World Animal Protection, Feedback, International Accountability Project, and Global Forest Coalition. And it explains how the investment in industrial livestock are harming the possibilities of achieving the Paris Agreement goals and also social justice. I have also some numbers and some figures on the investments that the major development banks have done on the expansion of industrial livestock, especially in Africa and Latin America. But there are also some reports for Asia if you're interested in finding out more, and also in becoming part of the campaign. We need us all to be together. We need us all to say to the MDBs to stop financing factory farming, to say the UNFCCC that they should tackle the climate crisis with a gender-based approach, a rights-based approach that moves away from the false solutions and that also takes into account agriculture for a just transition. We cannot think a just transition without or phasing out fossil fuels without thinking on a radical change on our food system. It took me a couple of minutes more, but Thanks a lot. I wish is a fruitful day for all of you.
That was a very interesting presentation, and Andrea rightly touched upon how a just transition is not possible without ensuring that it encompasses all three facets of food transition and also humans, animals, and the planet, keeping humans, animals, and the planet in mind. For the next presentation, we have Silvia and Arjun from World Federation for Animals. Silvia is the communications manager at the World Federation for Animals. She has over 10 years of experience supporting strategic communications and partnership development efforts of different United Nations agencies and programs across Africa, Asia, and Europe. We also have Arjun, who is the chief advisor on strategic policy and public affairs at WFA. Arjun has been active in the animal welfare community for over 10 years. And in his current role, Arjun leads the efforts of a large global alliance of animal welfare and animal protection organizations to establish the relevance and importance of animals and their welfare for sustainable development and environmental protection at the UN. I'm going to pass it over to Arjun and Silvia now.
Thank you so much, Pavitra. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for making the time to join us today. After such great presentations before us, we really hope we can make this as interesting for you and worth your time. I'm going to share the screen for the presentation that Arjun and I will be sharing with you. I'm just briefly going to. Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen. Otherwise, give me a shout out if not. So thank you so much for inviting us. Before we begin, let me just invite you to reach out to either Arjun or I after a session if you would like to connect. WFA is a global collaboration of more than 50 animal protection NGOs from across the world as of today. And we're organized by NGOs for NGOs to help all of us advocate effectively for global policies that protect animals. You can definitely learn more about our work at wfa.org or send us an email. So from our side, we hope that this session will motivate you to engage in policy process, and hopefully we can engage further in the future. We're going to talk about the purpose of policy change and engaging with governments. Arjun is going to start with a broad conceptual framework on this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a recently published report by WFA calling Unveiling the Nexus, where we're going to illustrate some of the decisions we took in line with this broad conceptual framework. And then Arjun is going to wrap up our presentation with some practical suggestions. So I'm going to invite Arjun to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Silvia. And so in the sort of presentation today, I wanted to focus very much on the practical experience that we've had in terms of policy engagement and moving the policy process to become more aware of and respondent to the issues of animal welfare that we all sort of work on. So what is the sort of purpose of policy change? I think most of you will understand this and agree. As animal welfare organizations trying to push the issue of animal welfare, animal protection, we, particularly in a policy context, will often find that it's like rolling a boulder up the hill. The issue is not front of mind in most governments, most policymakers, and so it still feels like a niche issue. And so sometimes we need to push really hard to get our issues reflected in policy change. So policy change can help us cement progress into place. So if there is a general sense of progress around animal welfare in a particular country, getting a policy change, getting a law to, for instance, ban caged poultry, then that allows us to perhaps stop pushing for a little bit, put a brick behind the boulder so the boulder doesn't roll back, and then see how we can move forward from there. Sometimes the policy process actually is very helpful in moving the goalposts, in the sense that legislators, government policy sometimes moves quicker than where the public or producers are in terms of their willingness to change. A good example of that is the global agreement to try and limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. That was not something that was perhaps front of mind of most people, but the policy change, the agreement that became our target has implications across the spectrum, and therefore is now helpful in trying to move the issues of climate change when it comes to animal production in particular. And third, it's a hook for encouraging the change we want by all stakeholders. Any type of legislation, regulation, policy change that is beneficial to animal welfare can then be used as we engage as organization with producers, with the public, to try and move them to get to the actual change that is needed on the ground. And so the next area I wanted to focus is how to engage with governments. And here we have to understand that for us, animal welfare, animal protection is front of mind. We think about it every day. We work on it every day. It is the thing that drives us. Whereas the people we try to move, particular policymakers, politicians, animal welfare, animals at all, are seldomly front of mind. They don't think about it. It's not part of their day-to-day schedule. It's not the thing that they engage with. And so in trying to move them, we always have to think about what do they need? How can our issue, how can the issue of animal welfare or animal protection be a solution to the problem that they are trying to engage with? And I often visualize it as me standing on one side of the road, a busy road, with my counterparts, the politicians, the policymakers I'm trying to move, standing on the other side. So now I have two choices. I can shout at them and tell them to come over to where I am, because that's where I want them to be. Or I can cross the road myself, take them by the hand and guide them across the busy road to where I want them to be. The second option is always going to be more effective, because we have to engage them. We have to make sure that they understand that the issues that they are concerned about are also the issues that we are concerned about. We just offer animal welfare, animal protection, the things that we care about as a solution to the problem that they are facing. And so, next slide. So the key thing to understand is, what is a government's agenda? What are they trying to achieve? How do they sort of fill their days? What are the issues that they're most concerned about? We as civil society organizations, activists, advocates, we don't set the agenda. We don't determine what governments talk about or think about or prioritize. So we have to start looking at what is their agenda. And so in doing that, here I always use this sort of seesaw visualization, where if you look at the seesaw at the present, it is not where we would like the animal welfare state to be. And so to move the seesaw up, normally the pressure that we apply is what I call in this visualization pressure A. It's the thing that we care about. It's the way we sometimes talk about. Most of the time we focus on the sort of ethical domain. It's the fact that animals are worthy of kindness, and animals are worthy of their welfare being respected. But that doesn't necessarily always work. That pressure that we apply is not necessarily enough to move the seesaw up to where we would like it to be. And so we have to start thinking about other ways to apply pressure, other arguments to use, other perspectives to think about. And so just as an example here, let's think about factory farming. We would like factory farming to end. We would we think that factory farming is the most egregious form of animal abuse, and if we end factory farming, suffering of animals will end. Simply asking for factory farming to end is often not going to be enough. But if we start thinking about what are the sort of key elements of the factory farming business model, what do they need for that model to be to create a profit, then we know that often what we see is they need certain inputs. They need animal feed, they need antibiotics, they need finance. So if we focus on those issues, we can apply different types of pressures. So what is in the seesaw picture here, pressures B, C, and D, which equally, just as pressure A that we try to apply, will move the seesaw to where we would like it to be. So next slide, please. So how do we make the issue relevant? We always have to think about three ways of doing it. First, we have to shift perceptions. For us, animal welfare is important because we care about animals. For policymakers, politicians, they look at animals as commodities. They look at animals as things that can be used. They look at animals as a source of livelihoods for people. Their perception is quite different. Take the issue of climate change. Here, policymakers very much look at animals as producers of greenhouse gas emissions. But there is a way to shift the perception. For instance, if we understand that the Earth has major carbon sinks, major processes, natural processes that capture carbon, the oceans, for instance, or tropical forests. But what people often don't think about is that the ocean can't capture carbon if there's no fish in the sea, because it's the fish that eat the phytoplankton and then drop the carbon on the bottom of the ocean. In forests, it's mammals that act as the main pollinators that allow the forest to regenerate. Without mammals in the forest, there's no regeneration of trees, and then there is no carbon capture. So this is a different way of looking at animals and the role that they play, and therefore the perception that people have will change, and we'll start to think about, okay, now what do we need to do to protect that part? The other is we need to move the narrative. Sometime in a policy debate, it is very, very difficult to raise the issues of animals or animal welfare because it doesn't seem relevant. For instance, if you are having a conversation with your friends and everybody's talking about their experience on their last holiday, and you have this great anecdote you want to talk about because you think it's going to be funny and everybody will enjoy it, and then suddenly, before you have the chance to tell your story, somebody changes the topic of discussion to something that's in the news, and so you still have this great story to tell, but the narrative, the flow of conversation is no longer appropriate for it. And so here, for instance, as an example, when member states were negotiating the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, we wanted to talk about animals and the need to protect animals from disasters as well. But the debate around the Sendai framework was very much centered around how do we save people's lives and how do we protect the critical infrastructure that people need. So in the course of that type of narrative, it is very difficult to make our voice heard. It's very difficult to make people think about animals and their role. And so rather than just pushing the issue of animal protection, we decided to try to shift the overall narratives. And so rather than talking about animals, we started asking questions like, okay, if the focus is to save people's lives, what happens after you save people's lives? It's not enough to save their lives. You also have to save or protect their livelihoods, because people need to be able to continue to prosper after a disaster has hit. Once that was accepted as part of the narrative, okay, yes, as part of our work on disaster risk reduction, we need to talk about saving people's lives and saving their livelihoods. We then move the conversation on to say, okay, what is necessary to protect people's livelihoods? What are the key productive assets that they need? And once that became part of the narrative, we could make the case that animals, for most people, are the key productive asset. And that led to the inclusion of the protection of livestock and working animals as a priority action for member states, for governments to take in terms of their overall strategy on disaster risk reduction. So this is just an example of how we shift the narrative to allow for our message to be heard. And then the final thing to always keep in mind is dollars and cents. Governments, policymakers will always think about, is it affordable? Is it going to be a beneficial return on investment? Is it going to cost? Is the inclusion of animal welfare regulation going to be a burden on our national livestock sector? And so you have to be able to make a business case, for instance. And so here, an example I would like to use is the discussion about rabies. For many, many years, this was an issue that has been going on. People have always been aware of this disease, but didn't find the argument to say, okay, we need to move further on this. So what we found is that working with WHO, FAO, and others, we estimated the annual total costs of rabies, and we all agreed it came to 8.6 billion per year. And then we started looking at what would it take if you start to vaccinate all dogs in all countries. What would be the cost of that? And then we found to do that over a space of 10 years, it would cost 6.4 billion. So suddenly you have this case where if you spend 6.4 billion over 10 years, you eradicate losses annually of 8.6 billion. The business case becomes very, very clear, which then led, of course, organizations like WHO, FAO, WOA, others to come together and think, okay, this is something that we can easily explain. The case is clear. Let's try and find a way to establish a financing mechanism that will allow us to raise that money to focus on dog vaccinations so that we can actually eliminate this disease. Next slide, please.
I think that'll be me.
Yes. So hand over to Silvia.
Thank you, Darjan. So before I dive in, I just want to give a little bit of a background, pause in the background, to better kind of get a picture of what I'm going to be talking about. So over a year ago, the UN Environment Assembly achieved what's probably a historic milestone for animal protection movement, because it recognized for the first time in a UN resolution that animal welfare can contribute to addressing environmental challenges, and that animal welfare can contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Apart from this very important language, they also tasked the UN Environment Programme to put together a report that would explore these interconnections between animal welfare, environment, and sustainable development. We believe that this report, this upcoming report, will hold great importance for animal protection organizations worldwide, because it's going to give us arguments that will have been endorsed by the UN that will serve as very powerful material to support our advocacy efforts with governments. We'll be able to use this report to urge policymakers to implement policies that address climate change, that tackle biodiversity loss and pollution while improving animal welfare. it'll give us evidence that enhancing the lives of animals goes hand in hand with ensuring food security, promoting global health, and securing livelihoods. So needless to say, this is a report that the movement is very keen on seeing coming through as a credible and timely report. So to facilitate this process and commemorate as well the resolution's anniversary, we at WFA and our members released a report entitled Unveiling the Nexus, and the image is the cover image of the report. We wanted, and our objective was, to encourage dialogue between policymakers and UN officials regarding these interconnected issues. So with that objective in mind, I'm going to share with you some of the decisions we made during the creation of the report that also speak to some of the guidance that Arjun just shared with us. So a particular decision that we took and that I want to highlight first is how we aim to link animal welfare to their issue of concern, meaning UN officials and policymakers. So at a high level, we identified sustainable development as the matter policymakers are concerned with, and thus try to illustrate how good animal welfare was an opportunity to deliver on this agenda, or vice versa, how the absence of animal welfare may threaten it. So on the one hand, we use diagrams like this that I'm showing you for each chapter that we had on the report. And we tried with these diagrams to visualize how, for example, the systems that suppress animal welfare are contributing to, in this case, biodiversity loss, and ultimately threaten sustainable development. On the other hand, we, for each chapter, consistently structure our arguments around two key aspects. First, we explain why each topic matters for sustainable development. For example, in this case, I'm just highlighting a passage where we noted on arguments on how biodiversity loss will undermine the delivery of 80% of the targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we proceeded to consistently emphasize in each chapter why animal welfare is relevant to the issue at hand, both negatively and positively. So here I'm just highlighting, for example, how, according to IPBES, the overexploitation of animals is one of the, if not the main driver of the biodiversity loss trends that we're seeing today in the 2020 report. So it was always important for us to link it to their issues of their concern. Not only negatively, but also positively within the chapters, we aim to identify issues of their concern that weren't as macro as sustainable development, for example, job creation. And doing this was very important for us because, as Arjun mentioned earlier, presenting animal welfare as an opportunity to address something that was pressing and concrete of a problem on others' agenda, our audience, is a way of effectively fostering collaboration. And this is a tactic that is used by many successful advocacy organizations. Recently, I attended a talk by Human Rights Watch, for example, where they were discussing their strategy to engage with a particular government to help the country move away from persecuting the opposition. And a key message that was passed on in their interaction with the finance minister is the link between foreign investment and the democratic rule of law. Political oppression is a threat to a thriving economy. And so they're linking effectively their concerns to the concerns of, in this case, the finance minister, in the case of an authoritarian government, to advance human rights. So I just, it came up in a talk and I thought it was a good example of how this is applied in other sectors as well by other organizations. Second, we strive to find reports or statements from different UN organizations named in the resolution that would support our report. So here I'm just showing you an example where we quoted FAO, but effectively in all chapters, we aim to find quotes or statements from the organizations that were named in the UN resolution. And for example, UNEP themselves, using their language as our arguments was a way of showing them that they themselves agree with us. Another decision that we took was to make sure all our arguments were either backed up by UN reports, as I was mentioning, or scientific studies. We really tried to not have any statements that could be read as emotionally driven. We fact-checked and provided recognizable and credible sources for basically, if not all, the statements in the report. And this we believe actually would help our product to be taken seriously by UNEP. When we gave UNEP the heads up that our report was coming, their initial answer was, quote unquote, "Thanks, we welcome inputs, particularly peer-reviewed science." And so I do think that the fact that our report was signposting many scientific studies may have contributed to their decision after our release of the report to share our report themselves with their major groups and stakeholders. That includes representatives from farmers, indigenous people, business and industry, and other civil society organizations representing dozens of groups. So yeah, this is, I think, the third point that I wanted to highlight. The fourth point in this is going back to Arjun's points of dollars and cents, is we really aim to convey the economic impact when evidence was available. Economic impact of either not considering or economic impact of improving animal welfare. So for example, here we help policymakers better assess the cost of not taking action in curtailing wildlife trade. Policymakers are concerned with economic matters, and framing arguments in monetary terms will help tap into existing political debates, but also increase the visibility and relevance of our advocacy efforts. Along the same line, we also aim to be solution-oriented. So each chapter was wrapped up in policy takeaways, highlighting action-oriented conclusions that could bring about change for animals. And then there are also some other points I want to highlight here that came through when we were putting the report together. On a similar note of being solution-oriented, we decided to use images that would allude to animals' interconnectedness with their environment. Whether it was pictures of animals in their natural habitats or that would reflect welfare, we wanted these images to portray, to convey the same attitude of being solution-oriented rather than solely focusing on problems. There are other type of campaigns, such as public mobilizations, where photos of animals in confinement, in close confinement, animal suffering may be more effective. For this particular case scenario, we wanted to use images that would be in line with our text. Another type of imagery that would have worked would be one where the relationship between animals and people is highlighted. Photos like that could have communicated the three dimensions of sustainable development: environmental, social, and economic. But yeah, the choice of imagery is definitely an important part of the process for us in sharing a message with policymakers. Seventh, and then I'll have another point and I'll hand back to Arjun, is we aimed, and this is not revolutionary, this is something commonly done, but it was important for us that we provide a common starting point with key definitions, including what we understand for animal welfare, what we understand for One Health, what we understand for Nexus, and what we understand for sustainable development. I should rephrase it, not what we understand, what should be understood in the context of this report, using official definitions with evidence to scientific studies. And then lastly, something that is also commonly done by flagship reports, but I would like to mention it here because this is also something that we did, is to improve accessibility for policymakers with summary and graphics throughout the report. We also had an overview for policymakers, understanding that our audience has different rhythms of communication and may not have the time to go through the full report. We try to ensure that the key messages and policy takeaways were in this 2-pager summary with a graph that would ensure that our message is not lost in in their busy schedules. So yeah, I mean, I would love to, there are many other decisions that we took, but for, for time limitations, I'm going to leave it there. Of course, if you have seen the report and have feedback, would like to use it, or if you haven't seen it, I will certainly share the link if you want to, but I'm going to leave it there and then invite Arjun back to share some more overall solutions, suggestions.
Thank you, Silvia. And yes, I would agree that the Unveiling the Nexus report very much tried to inhabit many of the sort of lessons that we've learned. I just want to finish with some practical suggestions going further on what I talked about before. First is the technical and political side of the issue. If we think about policymakers, politicians, they usually look at an issue through three lenses. One is the evidence-based, the scientific knowledge that is out there. The second is the policy lens. It is what is achievable. Will it produce an outcome? How high is it on my list of priorities? So these are the sort of policy considerations that they make. And then finally, it's the political lens. Most politicians will have made certain promises to get elected. And so they have to take those things into account as well. And so what we often find, if you consider both sides, or all three sides, but particularly sort of the technical and the political side of the issue, and try to move the argument along both sides of the equation at the same time, you're more likely to be effective in producing the kind of policy change that you would like to see. One is understand that the people we engage with are just like us. Sometimes it can seem quite intimidating to talk to a politician or a senior official in government or an ambassador. But I think in my experience anyway, it's very important to understand that they are just like us. They are just people like us. They want to engage with people. They want to help. They want to be helped. Sometimes you can make a connection on something that has nothing to do with the issue you talk about, but creating that personal connection, just presenting yourself as a human being is often enough to start a real conversation. And sometimes you can use that very effectively. A quick example here, the Sustainable Development Goals, they were developed in 2015 in the political declaration, now has a line that we envisage a world in which humans live in harmony with nature, where all wildlife and other living species are protected. The original language just talked about wildlife and didn't have the phrase other living species in it. We had tried to argue or try to move the UN to reflect all animals, but that argument was rejected. And so at the very last moment, one of the ambassadors that we had been engaging with, I knew that he was a very devout Catholic. And so I showed him the text of a major speech that was given by the Pope, in which he talked about all living species. And so based on that, I suggested maybe you can add that to the text, wildlife and other living species. And because he associated himself with the Pope and the text of the Pope, he was willing to put that forward. And then that language was suggested, and now it's language that we can use to remind governments that this is something that they've committed to. And so sometimes, as I said, the human interaction can be very important. The other part is for policymakers to be willing to listen. It's often good that they recognize you, either the organization, yourself. So be present, be visible in the policy space. Participate as much as you can. The more you are seen as a partner in the process, the more likely policymakers are going to be willing to listen to you. And finally, I think this is important as well, apply an insider approach. Try always to look at it from a positive perspective. Try to look at policymakers, even if they don't do the thing that we would want them to do, even if they take decisions that we believe are the wrong decisions or based on the wrong arguments. Always look at them as partners. Criticizing them doesn't often help in terms of building a rapport with them and being able to be in the room to be able to deliver your argument. So an insider approach is always going to be preferable than an outsider approach, standing on the outside and telling everybody that they're wrong and we are right. Sometimes being right is not enough. It is getting your point across, and persuading is the name of the game here. So many more suggestions I can give you, but because of the time, I'll leave it there. Very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjun. Thank you so much, Silvia. That was a very insightful presentation, and I think all the practical suggestions that you've made were so easy to understand, and I know how difficult it can be to present something like that, because policy always scares like a lot of people, and you have made the suggestions in a way that it can be implemented by many organizations, even new organizations working in the policy advocacy space. So we do have some questions for you, and I'd like to pose the first question to you, Arjun. Have you come across any, like some individual policymakers who are in favor of advancing animal welfare? And if so, is it possible or wise for advocates to try and cultivate champions for animals if such people are working in their country?
Yes, I tend to work at the UN level, either in New York or Geneva or Nairobi. My experience is that the vast majority of people we engage with, once you have a conversation with them, you'll find that personally they're quite interested. Personally, they can be quite easily persuadable that protecting animals, advancing their welfare in policy processes is beneficial for animals themselves. The key is always to give them the right argument that they can use vis-a-vis their constituencies, which is their governments, and through their government back to the public. What is the argument they can use to say, we're doing this because we have already agreed to pursue a particular policy objective, and this is a helpful step in that process. But as I said, quite often at a personal level, they're there. They just need to be helped in understanding that what we are talking about is not a threat, but it is an aid. It is just part of the solution. Sometimes, as I said, you have to give them a way to shift their perception, give them a way to look at it in a different way. I always look, for example, for instance, in the debate around rabies. Before we started talking about it, a group of 100 dogs, one of them is rabbits, all 100 dogs suddenly become a threat. But in that same group of 100 dogs, if 99% of them are vaccinated, then 99% of the group of dogs suddenly is a protective shield to people. So it's that way of shifting the perception. Animals as a vector for good is sometimes very important.
Thank you, Arjun. Okay, so the next question is for Silvia. Do your suggestions on the communication styles and points mainly focus on advocacy with representatives at an international fora, or are there more or different techniques that you would need to be considered when advocating at a more national level? Of course, we're also conscious that advocates would presumably want to incorporate thinking about local culture as shared in the previous session of the event.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question rightly states that the examples that I gave apply to particular context, which is with UN officials and delegates from UN member states. I would say that many of those points about linking your issues to others' concern apply at the national and regional level. I think I think it was in the first session we heard about at the personal level, how the work with farmers in talking about their kids and their future and connecting, as Arjun said, we're all very similar. We all have similar concerns. So how can we connect to find synergies or areas to advance our agendas? So I think many of those issues are applicable as well at the national level. Being solution oriented is also something very, very applicable. I think that this does not disregard the importance of reminding everyone about the crazy numbers that we're seeing out there. We heard Andrea reminding us, and we all work on the animal protection movement, and yet it impacts us. It just gives us this momentum. So I'm not saying that using, for example, images of animals in what their actual conditions are is not a suitable strategy. I think it's very much case by case basis in terms of what the actual process is. I sometimes fear that we at the policy level, we are kind of moving away too much from those images, for example, and then, you know, the work of reminding people why we're doing it may be abandoned. So I think it's a balance. I apologize that my answer is not like a yes or no. But just to summarize, I think many of those issues are applicable. But it's really, I think, at the end of the day about knowing your audience. And so in our case, understanding what the UN officials were concerned for this particular process, understanding what the UN delegates need, which is quick information, quick solutions, quick suggestions on how to move forward. This perhaps would be a different product for a different process. But yeah, perhaps knowing your audience, but I think I'm preaching to the choir because you all do this job better than I do in terms of knowing your audience and tailoring the message to them.
Thank you, Silvia. I think you've answered the question perfectly. So the next question we have is from Jackson, who asks, can engaging at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific level be helpful to the high-level political forum?
The short answer is absolutely, yes. I think in affecting policy change, we always have to remind ourselves that to go from point A to point Z, we don't jump immediately. We go through B, C, D, E, and X. And so to always think of it as a journey rather than a revolution, perhaps. And so sensitizing our audience to new kinds of messages, new words, is always going to be very important. So engaging at the SCAP level, having a clear message in terms of what I talked about, the perception, the narrative, the dollars and cents, as well as a clear sort of ask, what kind of language do you want to see? If you do that at the regional level, and if you do that at all regional levels, and the language comes through across different regions and is repeated, sometimes repetition is enough as a way to get people to understand. If people hear the same phrase over and over again, eventually they'll start to repeat it themselves. There's some very good examples of where we use that. For instance, the work on the Committee on World Food Security, where we went at all of the regional consultations with the very same language proposal, which then eventually led to the Committee on World Food Security to adopt that language and clarify in what was then called the Principles for Responsible Investment in Agriculture and Food Systems that animal welfare is an essential requirement for sustainably enhancing productivity and protecting food quality and food safety. So these kind of languages came through the various regional consultations, and because the similar language was presented from each regional consultation at the final plenary session, it became almost unavoidable that that language then became part of the final product. And so engaging at SCAP level is always going to be helpful for HLPF, but for all other purposes as well, whether or not it's discussions in UNFCCC or CBD, it is about slow sensitization of the people that we hope will forward our message in the global national policy debate.
Thanks, Arjun. We do have a few more questions, but I think we're out of time. So thank you so much to both of you for perfectly capturing the essence of today's topic. And we also have, we will be sending out the questions to you if possible. If you have the time, then you can respond to it and we can share it with our participants. Just a reminder that we also have more webinars tomorrow at the same time, so please do join in, and I'm going to hand it back to you, Nokan.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pavitra, Aryan, and Silvia for the wonderful presentations. And thank you everyone for attending our event. I would like to conclude today's sessions with a brief introductions of upcoming events. So after this event, we will send a feedback form to you, and you are always welcome to share any ideas on how we can improve the quality of our events and also suggest new ideas for future sessions. And we have 3 sessions coming up tomorrow as well at the same time, with the first covering political landscape in animal welfare policies in Asia and the world. The second will cover advocating for policy changes, our definitions and what we have in our arsenal. And the last one will be about implications from international financial institution investment from an Asian context. And in August, we'll also have 2 other sessions lined up for the second installment of this policy event. And as many of you know, in October, we have 2 major physical events, both in Malaysia, the Asia Farm Animal Days, and also our AFA Sarawak Conference. Registration information can be found on our website. So if you have any queries about today's event, please let me know via email, policy@asiaforanimals.com. I will send that over in the chat box in a moment. And thank you once more for participating in our event, and see you tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, and I will conclude today's sessions now. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you. Thank you.